I think, I think well, welcome everybody. Thanks for braving the weather to make it to the American Enterprise Institute today. My name's Gary Schmidt. I'm a resident scholar and I direct the Maryland Ware Center for Security Studies here at AEI. Today's event, which is being co-sponsored by the Federalist Society, is a panel discussion of John Yu's latest book, Point of Attack, Preventive War, International Law, and Global Welfare. Our format today is going to be quite simple. John will start off with an overview of the book's thesis, and then we'll follow up with our two panelists' comments, and I might throw in a point or two as well. And then following that, we'll open up the floor to your questions and have a good, robust discussion, I'm sure. Before turning the mic over to John, however, let me first briefly introduce our two guest panelists, Michael Lewis and Harvey Rishikoff. As you can see from the biographical materials that you have in hand, both have had quite distinguished careers. Michael is currently a professor of law at Ohio Northern University. He's a former Navy pilot, a Harvard Law graduate, and more importantly, a graduate of Navy's Top Gun program. Michael has written extensively in the areas of the laws of war and the laws of war as applied to the current war on terrorism. Harvey currently chairs the ABA's Advisory Committee on Law and National Security, and he's a former professor at the National War College, and he's also served as the chair of the college's strategy department. Among other important posts he has held, he was the legal counsel to the FBI's deputy director in the late 90s and has had his hand in drafting several important national security-related presidential directives. Thank you both for joining us today. Now let me introduce John Yu. John has been teaching law at University of California, Berkeley Law School for 20 years more than 20 years, and has been a colleague here at AEI for the past decade. A former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and law clerk to Justice Thomas and Judge Silverman, he is the author of 5 major volumes and numerous scholarly articles on presidential power, the laws of war, and international law. His most recent book, the one we're talking about today, Point of Attack, is like his other books in that there is nothing, quote, shy or retiring in John's argument, nor do his books ever lack for intellectual courage. Who else could be a visiting scholar at AEI and write that the surge in Iraq, whose idea was given birth to right here in these spaces, might not have been as important as we here at AEI claim? And who else would dare to argue that the current international law regime is problematic precisely because it discourages the use of force rather than encouraging it? I can see John now being offered a record contract with the idea of remaking John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance into Give War a Chance. Like all of John's books, Point of Attack is a deeply serious work and has great merit in pushing his readers to think anew their most deeply held assumptions. In short, while provocative, Point of Attack is provocative in the best sense, making all of us ask the important questions and in turn thinking more seriously about what the answer should be when it comes to enhancing global prosperity and security. John, over to you.
Thanks, Gary, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at AEI. It's been my home away from home for the last 10 years. And like all homes away from home, the people are happier here, the food is better here. It's just too expensive for me to live here. But it's been a great 10 years. This is my 10th anniversary here at AEI, and it's been a great time. And this book actually is the product of that 10 years because I started actually working on it when I came here after the Iraq War. And this is my effort to try to make sense of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and a lot of the other conflicts we've been going through as a country. It's also great to have Gary as the moderator. I couldn't think of a perfect person. He's one of the few people who shares an intense interest in the framers and national security and intelligence. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I had stolen one of Gary's great ideas from his dissertation for my last book, on Thomas Jefferson's views on the executive power. And Gary actually has the view that Jefferson actually had quite a robust approach to the presidency in practice, but not in theory. And I tried to disseminate that idea through my own work. I think it's a really important point. And you were the first one, I think, to realize that and to explore it. It's also a great pleasure to be here with Mike Lewis and Harvey. Mike was on the front lines. Harvey was at the National War College, so he was on the rear lines, I guess, in our war effort. It's great to be with them both and look forward to the discussion. And I just want to make one recognition that my mentor for many years, Judge Lawrence Silberman, is here. He's very angry at me for writing this book, but he claims I've stolen the idea from him. And with many other things, I admit it. I did steal it from him, but he didn't publish it fast enough. So I got there first. But I just want to pay special mention to him because he's someone I started working for right after law school, and he also combines, like many of us on the panel, that interest in national security and law, which is actually all too rare, I think. And so he was an inspiration for this book. He is entirely responsible for its faults, I might add. So I just want to lay out the simple thesis and then maybe start talking about Russia and the Crimea, because a lot of and maybe about East Asia, although we're going to have another panel tomorrow about East Asia. The simple thesis, and I think the Russian invasion of Crimea just highlighted this, is that the current international legal system of collective security, I think, has failed. The one that centers around the United Nations and the UN Security Council. The primary rule is that the use of force in international law is illegal, even criminal, unless it's in self-defense or when authorized by the UN Security Council. I think historically that rule and its reliance on just war theory actually is incorrect, that the effort by, this is really the work of Woodrow Wilson in establishing the League of Nations, the idea that this rule, this criminalization of war, harkens back and builds on the just war tradition that ran from Cicero all the way through the great medieval thinkers. And actually, if you go back, that's one thing I just started with. If you look at the just war tradition, the just war theory, which is very wrapped up in Catholic legal theory, of course, because of the church, just war theory actually is much more nuanced and talks about lots of things we talk about today, like humanitarian intervention, preventive and preemptive war, in ways that go well beyond the simple idea that any use of force other than self-defense is illegal. I also think that institutionally, just as a matter, nor is it just countries have not followed this idea of just war, criminalized war other than self-defense historically, and I think they aren't doing it today under the UN Charter itself. Institutionally, there have been plenty of wars since the UN Charter. They've never been authorized by the UN, and we're not in self-defense. And the UN, I think, has been powerless, fairly powerless to stop it. And again, the invasion of Ukraine is just a good example. Part of it is the rule, but part of it also is the institution, that if you require the full agreement of the permanent members of the Security Council to authorize measures against any kind of aggression, and China and Russia sit on the Security Council, well, they're going to veto any effort to respond to an invasion of Crimea, or, looking down the future, any military engagements that might arise in the South China Sea or in Asia. Which essentially renders not just the rule being denied in practice, but also means institutionally the UN Charter, the American-led effort to create a system to manage conflict after World War II just doesn't work, and it's failed. It's really not going to work for the future. That doesn't mean that great power war is an inevitability, or that something that we can't respond to and control. Actually, the other remarkable thing is that during this period after World War II, the amount of death and destruction from great power war has actually fallen to a low that's unheard of in human history. That by a whole order of magnitude, the deaths that we have experienced from great power wars has fallen to a level never seen before since the beginning, since the Peace of Westphalia and the beginning of the modern nation-state system. It's an incredible record, but I don't think it has anything to do with international law. A few historians Political scientists, they say there's a number of different reasons. One primary one is clearly nuclear weapons makes it much harder, more expensive, and dangerous for the great powers to come to conflict. The balance between the superpowers for much of the Cold War actually had the effect of suppressing conflict between the great powers. And then since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the United States as a sort of hegemonic supplier of peace and stability and free trade around the world has also reduced great power conflict. But one way to look at this is that the great source of war, the two world wars that killed the most people in human history, both started in Europe and were between European powers. It spread to the rest of the world. Despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually is a good symbol of what had preceded it. Until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were no deaths from combat in Europe. There had been no unilateral drawing of new borders in Europe by force. The one area that had produced all these conflicts that caused so much of the deaths of the last 200-300 years amongst the great powers became a peaceful place. And I think that was primarily responsible for nuclear weapons, the bipolar struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but then ultimately, since then, the U.S. role in maintaining a certain international order. At the same time, there are threats to that order which are being posed by what we used to call rogue nations. The fancy term now is revisionist nations, nations that want to challenge the international system, like Iran, maybe China, clearly Russia. Challenges caused by the proliferation of WMD technology, the rise of international terrorist groups, and even large humanitarian catastrophes. These are all challenges to the international system that has produced this great period of peace and prosperity. And this is where I get to Gary's quite right to say, give war a chance, which I would have given as a title of this book, but PJ O'Rourke had already taken. I actually looked it up on Amazon. I was like, darn. That actually a certain kind of war is actually under supply because of this ban in international law on any use of force other than self-defense. It actually prevents Western allies and the United States from intervening in smaller places to shore up the international system. So, for example, Rwanda, Kosovo, right, Iraq. These are all places, and again, the Ukraine, the South China Sea. These are all areas where the system actually prevents, it discourages nations from using force where we might want to, because the gains to the world are going to be much higher than any costs of conflict. Under international law as it is now, those wars are all those conflicts would be illegal. And I think an international system or set of rules and an international system ought to encourage the powers to use force to control those kinds of threats to the international system. It doesn't need to worry about war between the great powers where international law doesn't have much effect, and the peace has been kept for other reasons anyway. Just one way, this is maybe one last way to understand this thesis is that this is very similar to the way law and economics scholars think about contract law or tort law, where there may be a rule saying you should keep promises, right? You should obey contracts. But the law actually encourages you to breach the contract if you can do something that's more efficient, right? That actually is a greater benefit. That was something that lawyers fought over for many decades until under the influence of Judge Richard Posner and Frank Easterberg and so on in the 70s at the University of Chicago, this view began to prevail and actually now has become the law in many jurisdictions. It's a very similar approach to international law, where I think if there's a norm against war, it should be one that countries can breach if it makes the world better off after the war. So let me turn now to what this means about Russia, ways to respond to Russia. And maybe this would be a good focal point for the discussion, though it doesn't have to be. I think Washington, it seems strange, we were paralyzed, it seems to me, Washington, looking at from California at least. The Beltway seems paralyzed about what to do in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Part of that might have to do, we can't get the UN or other international institutions to cooperate. And in part that's because there are several prominent members, Russia and China, which are opposed to anything, any kind of activity. So here's some things which I think we could do to respond to Russia, which we haven't, which I think would be consistent with this approach to international law, which may well be seen as troublesome, or potentially even illegal under the UN Charter. But first thing I would say is that the United States should terminate the START Treaty. If you remember, the START Treaty is the one that limits both the U.S. and Russia to 1,550 nuclear weapons, places other limits on the delivery vehicles. But it's an effort to treat the United States and Russia as the same when it comes to nuclear arsenals, even though Russia is not really projecting power around the world anymore, and the U.S. has a lot of other global responsibilities for peace and stability. It doesn't make any sense for the United States to treat Russia as an equal. It seems to me it can terminate the treaty, and the nuclear arsenal can float to whatever it needs to be for our security obligations, rather than any kind of commitment with Russia. Obviously, the second thing, someone was describing some position President Obama took in Malaysia about how he's only trying to hit singles in foreign policy these days, not doubles, and certainly not homers. And it seems to me in Ukraine right now, we're just looking at called third strikes, right? Because the only military aid we're giving to Ukraine is meals ready to eat. And it seems to me even under President Carter, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, we did more than give the Afghan rebels food. It seems to me another thing that we could do, this would actually be very difficult under the charter, but under this set of rules, I think it would be fine, would be to give military aid to the Ukraine, and like President Carter did in Afghanistan, supply any kind of rebels that there might be in the Crimean region to Russian control. Third thing I think you could do would be to restore the anti-ballistic missile systems in Eastern Europe that the Obama administration pulled out as a sort of diplomatic offering of a reset in relations. That seems to have, this reset has clearly failed. If Russia wants to go around invading its neighbors, the United States could send a strong signal of its support for its allies without any boots on the ground, without any military conflict with Russia, by putting those systems up. It worked before. The ABM system in the 80s helped the Soviets go bankrupt and helped contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union. Why not give it another try? And then the last thing I would say is we should end our cooperation with Russia on Syria. I don't see why the U.S. should be a partner with Russia in an action which actually is having the effect of propping up the Syrian regime and actually switching the momentum of the civil war towards the Assad regime. And lastly, I think this is the more stronger, it's very difficult to see this happening quickly, but could happen over the longer term, is institutionally create an alternative to the UN, create an alternative to the Security Council, where we don't give permanent vetoes to authoritarian governments like Russia and China. Something in the book I propose, a concert of democracies, where you still need an institution, a process to legitimize the use of force, then create one. Doesn't have to be focused around the UN and the Charter. It could be focused around those countries that are democracies, have open markets, and have the same values as the United States. So with that, thank you very much. I look forward to the comments.
Thank you all for coming out, and to the AEI for having me here. I think Professor Yu is absolutely right that the UN Security Council is broken, that the permanent veto is going to prevent the use of force in places where the use of force would improve human welfare. He had mentioned that the number of great power wars and the people that have died in great power wars has diminished to near zero since the institution of the United Nations. But at the same time, the number of internal struggles, of civil wars, low-intensity conflicts around the world has gone way up, as have the number of people dying in those conflicts all over the world. And the idea of saying you can improve human welfare by intervening in these conflicts and preventing these conflicts from having the kind of humanitarian disasters that they become in many cases is a legitimate use of force, but it's a use of force that is absolutely forbidden by the UN Charter now, unless we can get Russia, China, and the United States to all agree at the same time that this is a place where we want to use force. The only other exception to that would be Article 51, self-defense, and in most cases that does not apply. Another point that Professor Yu makes in his book is that there is at least an undercurrent of nations that have sort of through state practice indicated a willingness to go beyond where the UN Charter says they are supposed to go in terms of using force to prevent either humanitarian crises or other kind of disasters. So whether it be Tanzania intervening in Uganda, or Vietnam and Cambodia, or India and Bangladesh, all of which were unilateral interventions, or a collective intervention like NATO in Kosovo, where you had a group get together and decide we need to stop the humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. Those have all been criticized at some level or another, but they have also all been praised at some level or another for the kinds of good they have done. The central theme, or one of the central themes to the book, though, is to say, how do we figure out when a war is going to be a net benefit to human welfare? It has a law and economics sense to it in that it is saying you have to calculate, here are the benefits that are going to accrue from using force here. Here are the lives that will be saved, and here are the lives that will be improved as a result of doing whatever happens, whether it be Libya, Syria, Iran, etc. And while that is, I think, a laudable idea, in practice it is going to be very difficult. And I think we can look at, perhaps the best way of looking at things is look at the paradigmatic example, which would be Rwanda. Everybody looks back and says, how could 800,000 to 1 million people have been killed with machetes and small arms in the late 20th century, while all of Europe and the rest of the world stood by and watched? It seems that cries out for intervention. But looking at the one intervention that has happened in the last few years, Libya, is a good example of the indeterminacy of the good that is done. And I guess what I mean by that is that whenever you intervene, and intervention is a nice word, but what you are doing is killing people. You are going to go in and kill people. Whether it be the Libyan command, control, and communications people, or the air defense people, or some of the Libyan special forces or ground forces that we attacked, you're going to kill those people, and sometimes you're going to kill the wrong people. You're going to kill civilians, you're going to have collateral damage. The French and the British were criticized for the amount of collateral damage in the strikes in Libya that killed civilians when they were going after the command and control in Tripoli. And so you are going to be able to hold up and say, these are actual people that died that should not have. Now you tell me who you saved. And I don't know how we can tell exactly how many people were saved by Libya. I don't know exactly what the estimates are, but the best you can do is come up with a historical counterfactual saying, if we had not done this, this is what would have happened. And you're going to have to convince skeptics and other nations that are opposed to the action that this, in fact, would have been the case. And I guarantee you that had we intervened in Rwanda, if you were going to turn around and try to convince the world that you'd saved 800,000 lives by intervening in Rwanda, there's no way anyone would have believed you. It would have been a neo-colonialist act by the French, the Belgians, the Americans, to go back in and reestablish control over a lost colony. And no one would have believed that you'd saved 800,000 lives by doing so. And the counterfactual nature of this means that while I agree that there is value to intervention, that intervention should be undertaken on a number of occasions, that if you do so, you have to be very clear-eyed about the fact that nobody's going to thank you for doing it. Nobody's going to look back and say it was a great thing that you did that. Nobody's telling us that for Libya. Nobody's telling us that for Iraq. And so as long as you don't expect people to thank you, as long as you don't expect people to fully support everything you do, because for political, geopolitical reasons, I guarantee you that Russia, China, others will criticize any of those actions you take. You have to be prepared to accept that and do the best you can to back up the claim that here's the counterfactual that we avoided.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Let me thank AEI. I've been here before, and it's always great to create a forum like this. AEI is deeply committed to the John Stuart Mill principle of having open debate about interesting and hard subjects. So I have a lot of affiliations, so these are on my remarks alone. They don't represent any of the groups that I'm associated with or involved with. So this is quite fascinating for me because on John's 10th anniversary, he's revealed himself to be a Canadian international idealist interventionist, which is fascinating. And the book, which I find intriguing, who in her earlier work probably would have found extremely compelling, is the current ambassador for the United States to the United Nations, Samantha Powers. So if you read the book, you can make a strong argument that John has become Samantha, out of power.
That happens all the time in California.
Out of power. And so why is that? So it is because, first of all, it's a classic John Hughes piece of work. He rereads all the classics, Grotius, the Romans, the Greeks, Augustine, St. Thomas. The first, it's really almost an open beginning of international relations that we used to teach. But he reads it completely differently than everyone else. He comes to a different conclusion about what is embedded in the doctrine. And that doctrine then allows him to make an argument of why you can have a principle of prevention tied to morality. And the morality is tied to much more of a classic Posner conception, or Coe's conception of cost-benefit analysis. So he marries economic theory to international policy based on a principle of global goods and global common goods. So it's a very creative argument, putting together literatures you don't normally see together. It's classic you. So is it good or bad? Well, like everything else, it depends. So as my colleague to the left, who actually had been at the point of the spear, John rejects the concept of jus ad bellum as being tied and being ripped apart from its tradition. And therefore, our traditional, the way we teach it is that, you go through the steps of, is there a just cause? Is there comparative justice? Is there competent authority? Is there a right intention? Is there probability of success? Is it last resort to use force? And finally, the proportionality is the classic way we teach it. And he really homes in on that. But he doesn't talk about, which I'd like to hear him say, about jus in bello, which is the classic doctrine about how we make distinction, proportionality, combatants and non-combatants. And the other absent part, which I'm sure John has become like Posner, every 2 weeks another book will be produced, is that there's something we call about jus post bellum. So the great line about jus post bellum is Scowcroft's line, which is the issues where John wants to intervene in are very hard, nasty internal issues. You also, and we'll get to his notion of proliferation, but most of them, civil wars, ethnic conflicts, and morality, it's very hard for Americans to stand on the side and watch that take place, particularly for many of us who have deep experience of World War II. The irony is what Scowcroft used to say is, intervening in these cases doesn't solve them. It gives you win the right to try to solve them in the intervention. Because the assumption is that the people you're intervening with will embrace the ideas and values that we carry as Americans and the values of what we understand the world should be. That is somewhat unclear, actually. And not only that, but the assumption of John's book, because you stay at the high level of what the values are and our interests, is how far do you go? So one of the great cleavages in the world system is, how do you treat women? We've gone through quite a struggle inside the United States for equality and equal rights. But if you deal with certain ethnic groups, such as Orthodox Jews, they have a certain protective about how they see women, which is not particularly accord with the way we understand it under the evaluation of equal rights. So what values and how far do you want to push what we see as the American way? Because as you know, there are many parts of the United States that are resisting the American way. Where do you stand on abortion? Where do you stand on a whole range of issues? Would we want those values? What is the logic of it? So when you start at that level of abstraction and you then have to dive down into the specifics, that's where the devil's in the details, and why you explained that we have not been very good at nation building. We've been very good at nation building when we occupy. And whether we like it or not, the American way of war is that it's unconditional surrender, which is historically what we used to do. in World War I, World War II, and then we actually occupied Germany and we occupied Japan. The irony about America, we always say, is that we win the wars, but we lose the negotiations. And that's also interesting what that means for the evolution of where we are with Afghanistan, where we are with Iraq today. What is the goal? So I found the book extremely fascinating. It's always really putting forward a whole range of arguments to go forward. But then the logic is really, where does one understand when one wants to intervene for the common good? Because the Caroline products is the prevention doctrine, the Caroline case. And the actual phrase, which is quoted in the book, which is, again, refers to a phrase you almost never see in the literature. He refers to Canadian rebels. You almost never hear, I'm originally Canadian. You never hear of the Canadians, who are people who historically apologize to answering machines rather than be rebels. And the issue is, the actual logic of the doctrine is, which is Webster responding to the ambassador of England, necessity of self-defense was instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment of deliberation. And that the British force, even supposing the necessity of the moment, authorized them to enter the territories of the United States at all, did nothing unreasonable or excessive, which I would say is just Cimbello, since the act justified by the necessity of self-defense, it's the cost-benefit analysis of self-defense, must be limited by that necessity and kept clearly within it. And there it was very simple because the object was clear. They blew up the ship. The object of intervening and prevention at the national level is much more different than blowing up a ship. So I will leave you with the famous Daniel Bell problem about the problem with sovereignty states, and we all agree with the United Nations having trouble being effective, is that the problem with the nation state is that it's too big to deal with ethnic problems and problems of identity. And it's too small to deal with transnational problems like the warming of the environment, of the global environment. And we don't have a mechanism. The state, but nonetheless, the state has proven to be almost extraordinarily resilient, because down deep I'm a closet Weberian, which means I believe the state is the monopolization of the legitimate use of coercive force within a given geographical territory. And the argument is that what John is asking for, if you take the logic of the Weberian analysis, he would like America to be the entire state alone. Because he will do it unilaterally as opposed to in posses. You have concert of democracies, but as you know, it's hard for the democracies to historically to actually have firepower around the world. So that's sort of the deep paradox of the book, which is it sets the principle of morality, but then it doesn't have really a mechanism of understanding, once you exercise that principle, in the end, what would the world look like based on that particular understanding of your sense. And I'll end with, we always agree that Wilson was extraordinary idealist, in a way you're a different type of idealist, but it was the first and only time we ever elected a president who had a PhD in political science. And we try not to let people from Princeton anymore. It's also a good rule that you follow in the United States. So with that, I'll turn it back for the debate.
Well, as somebody who has a PhD in political science, I fully appreciate the fact that I should never be president. John's given me the license to be an immoderate moderator, so I'm going to actually throw in a few tidbits into the discussion. One of the nice things about John's book is actually the degree to which he actually unpacks in a very useful way the scholarship and the literature on the just war tradition, and shows, I think, the poverty of where it's been taken over the last century, and particularly the last couple of decades. And it does remind me that, in some respects, when Augustine is talking about just war theory, or talking about war, it becomes very analogous to policing. Augustine tends to think of military efforts as keeping order. Obviously, this is within the context of a Roman Empire. But there is a sort of an analogy to what John's arguing about the role of the United States and other democracies when it comes to policing the world, when it comes to WMD and terrorism and the like. So I think it's a valuable part of the book. But it did strike me that there was a couple other well, there's a number of things I want to talk about, but I don't want to hog the mic. John also talks about, the history of the development of the UN Charter, and points out that Mark Trachtenberg has rather conclusively shown that the American participants in the UN Charter and those involved in drafting didn't believe that it would be this restriction, that wouldn't have the restriction that it's come to have on U.S. behavior, that, if we needed to do something to maintain international stability and security, there's nothing in the Charter, they thought, which would stop us from doing so. And the truth is, and if I was a realist, I'd say, well, the UN Charter hasn't stopped us, and so therefore, why not just go ahead and accept the fact and probably make a more robust argument based upon the founders of the drafting founders, and to say, look, we never signed up to this as being this kind of restriction, and what's more, our practice has followed that along. Now, I suppose the answer to that is that Americans, because democratic people, like to have legitimacy, and so this issue of having others agree with you that you're doing the right thing is not unimportant. But then I think that also flips into one of the things I think that perhaps John was writing the book now as opposed to a year ago, you'd have to wonder about. In the book, there's a kind of an optimism about the fact that great powers are not interested in territorial acquisitions. And we've certainly seen in the case of Russia, that's not the case. And we worry on a constant daily basis about whether that's true for Chinese, who have a lot of territorial claims on islands, and big islands, small islands, lots of islands in their neighborhood that they have not given up. And so then the question is whether or not the UN Charter as understood actually doesn't provide a kind of useful pause, or at least gives their desires and their acquisitions a little less legitimacy than otherwise. If we open the door, as John suggests, one wonders about what the practical effects on those powers, thinking about what they can do on the international stage. So there's a kind of optimism about the great powers, I think, that pervades the book, and one has to wonder whether that optimism is warranted, or whether it's warranted in the decades ahead. Which brings me back to my final issue or question is, John talks about enforcing the new international order that he's proposing, and he tosses out the idea of analogous to the Council of Europe, the Council of Democracies. But when you look at, for example, which I think is a really fine interpretation of that council, which is in Kissinger's diplomacy book, Kissinger points out essentially that there are two elements to that, why that system worked. The first one had to do with coherence between the continental powers, having to do with the kinds of regimes they were and what they thought was legitimate. The second element, of course, was that in the terms of the balance of power element to that effort, that system, depended upon Great Britain, London, taking an active hand in maintaining it. But as we know, Castlereagh failed in that regard, and the Brits basically did everything possible to stay away from that active role. And that brings us to today, where there's a real open question about whether or not, if you did have a council, of democracies, whether the United States, would have the willpower to provide that kind of leadership. We certainly have doubts about it over the last few years. And then the second thing, of course, is that these other democratic great powers, be it Germany, Britain, Japan, it's not the case that they're spending much on their military, so one wonders about the effectiveness of their ability to help maintain that international order. So just as a practical matter, while I accept John's argument about sort of the nature of the flaws of the current system, I wonder how effective the mechanism for maintaining what he proposes will be.
So I have a two-finger one on that, which is that many theorists always generate the international relations theory, I remember my good friend Bob Art generated his book about the 7 different ways that you can have, basically, or 8 ways to exercise authority, whether it's offshore balancing or dominant, whatever it is. And then I always say to Bob, it's really great, but, I'm in the world of what's the force structure look like? What is the force structure for the different views you have? Because we're not that mobile, and as we know, we're having a drawdown. So the interesting question for John is, what do you perceive as the force structure that would be used? And then how do you see the concept of Title 10 and Title 50? Because if you look at Russia and the event you said, there's a lot of the use of what we call a Title 50 using of surrogates, not an open recognition of a Title 10 under the traditional military. So we've given you some food for thought, so I guess we should allow you to respond.
Well, there's a lot of really interesting questions and points. I don't think I have enough time to respond to all of them, so I'm just going to respond to some of them so we have time for audience questions and so on. But response to Professor Lewis's point about the cost benefits being hard, I think that's true. I mean, that's right. I don't think it's a reason to reject the approach. It's right to say that it's going to be very difficult to put into practice, but it does remind me of the early criticisms of cost-benefit analysis in the regulatory state, too, which is not early criticisms, ongoing and even getting louder and louder. People make similar arguments today about how do you do environmental regulation? How can you value human life versus precautionary measures about pollution or global warming? And those involve those exact same kinds of, how do you value or even know that there was a certainty that a life was saved? We do, there's a huge bureaucracy over at the White House in the Office of Management and Budget that tries to do this, but there's an interesting paper that showed that across the federal agencies that do cost-benefit analysis, each agency had a different value for human life. So they were all calculating it differently when they were deciding which regulations to issue. And so that's just a species of problem. It's going to be very hard. I can completely concede that. I think it's the right start, and that hopefully when we start doing it, we'll get better at it. And at least it would allow us to identify the easy cases, which we don't even, where the system doesn't even allow us to intervene now. So you said Libya is the harder case, but Rwanda seems like the easy case. That there you could say there would have been 1 million lives saved if we had used 5,000 to 6,000 troops. And so at least we could pick off the easy ones and agree on those, even though the harder ones that are closer to the actual balance being equal would be very hard. I agree with that. And I take the point that no one's going to thank us. That's a part of the book. I think the international system as it is now is actually kind of tragic, because there's a huge disincentive to ever lift your finger to help any of these countries, to intervene anywhere. Gary makes that point too, right? The resources involved are going to be so expensive. Why should any nation undertake this thankless task? And so part of what I try to show in the book is that actually maintaining this system is much to the benefit of the United States too, as well as our allies. I totally take, and this is Gary and Harvey's points, the system that I'm arguing for is going to have enormous free rider problems, because we will, if we do create the force structure, we do take this role, which is actually the opposite of where the administration I think now is going. I think we're actually pulling back from parts of the world. If we actually enhance our position, we retool the armed forces to play this more, which actually makes it more of a naval and air power and less land power, which is more in keeping with the traditional American force structure. But if we go towards this kind of force structure that intervenes here and there to keep the balance of power intact and stop these kinds of affairs.
Sparta and Athens.
Yeah, you don't agree. But if we do that, that's going to call for increases in defense spending, not the drawdowns that we're seeing, that both the president and Congress seem to agree on right now. And so that's part of the tragedy of the way the system works now, is that no nation should have an incentive actually to produce this kind of what is law enforcement or peacekeeping or this level of war. To Harvey's point about, I think he's quite right that one thing that I lack is a theory of jus in bello and jus post bellum. And I think that one thing that's very artificial about the way we study war is that we actually think of those as 3 distinct subjects, right? So there's different rules for each one, and you're supposed to, right, when you start a war, then you throw out the reasons you started the war, and then you just use the laws of the war fighting, and then once you're done with that, you toss that out, and then you get to and then you get to Reconstruction law. I mean,
Occupation.
yeah, use post bellum is the law that governed Reconstruction of the South, right, during the Civil War. And I think so. Part of the analysis, if I was going to carry it forward, and I completely that's the plan. Jeremy Rabkin's in the audience too. And we've been talking about this, like how to, right, reconceptualize the laws in war. But I think they all have to be connected. You have to have a common analysis for all three, and that you shouldn't actually think of them as separate and distinct. And certainly, the reasons you go to war should shape the rules you're going to use once you're in the war. So I completely agree with you. I think that's actually the next set of work to get to. Just one idea, though, would be that if you're going to take this kind of efficiency approach to war, then it should allow you to use all kinds of war-fighting techniques, which would be very doubtful under the jus in bello rule. So the one example would be the Kosovo War. The Air Force, you might recall, dropped graphite weapons onto the electrical grid in Belgrade, right, which is a violation of the laws of war. We attacked a purely civilian infrastructure target, right? Unless you say, because some of the electricity got to, but then under that theory, almost every civilian, right, thing like food production, electricity,
Not necessarily.
telecommunication networks, markets would all have some piece that got to the military that you could attack them.
Well, the example that I don't want to interrupt, but we're toying with the idea in cyber that you might be requiring people to create a separate type of cyber connection for their military and not use the dual use. Not use the dual use. And as a way of demonstrating the way we make the distinction of combatant and non-combatant, that there may be ways of imposing that in the future in cyber in order to take account of what your issue is.
See, to me, what the Kosovo example and that kind of example show was actually that you could attack certain kinds of infrastructure without destroying them, but it wasn't purely military, but it was connected because of the strained way you wanted to fight the war to achieve a certain narrow end, which wasn't defeating and conquering Serbia, but which was just to get it to leave Kosovo. And so if that's the case, then cyber also, right? So if we're at war with Kosovo today, with Serbia today, and we're trying to persuade them to leave Kosovo, what if we shut down their stock market for a week? Right? That would have no lives lost. It would be painful for much better than dropping real bombs, it seems to me. But under the current laws of war, you're not allowed to do that, right? That's a civilian target. And so it seems to me that if you did employ this kind of global approach that brought together all three types of laws of war, you would have to re-examine some of the fundamental principles of the other ones because they're dictated by why you went to war in the first place. But I think that's a really... Then the last one, I just quickly get to Gary's points before we turn it over to question, answer, and discussion, is there's a lot of great points there. On the UN Charter, I do think that it may not stop us all the time, but is a disincentive, and it harms, I think, us. And I think it's a much bigger deal in other countries. But to take one example, the Libyan intervention example, this administration wanted to get UN authorization to intervene in Libya, and the common account is it delayed, our intervention almost until the rebellion was wiped out. And today, you're a better expert at this than I, but people sometimes say that our delay allowed the more radical elements to have a bigger voice in the Libyan rebellion. And now, maybe President Obama, the Obama administration didn't really want to intervene anyway and was using the charter as a convenient excuse. Who knows? It seems to me that they seem quite committed to it. It's also in Syria, right? The lack of UN authorization is a reason that the Obama administration has been giving for not intervening more directly in Syria. So I do think it is having some effect. Maybe on the margins, it's just another thing that gets added to the cause benefit that, this war is going to be illegitimate. It will lead to political resistance. In the Iraq War, Germany, France, some of our supposed allies used the UN Charter as a reason not to help us in the Iraq invasion. But I think you're quite right. It's hard to find cases where it's the sole dictating reason why we might not have intervened or why other countries but it is I think it's an additional political cost to going to war. It's a disincentive when some of these wars, I think actually the system would be better off if we did go to war. On the, excuse me, and I think it's very hard to, I think you're right, like what does the future look like if you move away from the UN Charter system? What does the institution look like? The Concert of Europe is just a sort of something, an analogy to the past, one thing that's successful is our colleague John Bolton, I think, came up with this idea, the Non-Proliferation Initiative, which has a kind of system, but there's no formal treaty, there's no formal place where they meet, right? The governments coordinate their actions politically to try to stop the proliferation of WMD technology, as I understand, quite successfully. And I would think that would be the way to go, is to start studying those kinds of successful, informal methods of cooperation. Or it doesn't have the Russians and Chinese really involved. They're not vetoing us when we block North Korean freighters that seem to have hidden nuclear material on them. And so that's the model I think you could go, is if that has been a success, we should study that more closely, use that as a model to really build a new kind of concert of democracies. But I quite agree with you. If you get rid of the UN Charter, you replace it with nothing, then I think you'll have these problems of whenever any war is legitimate, everybody will always say when they intervene that the war is legitimate. The Russians are saying their intervention of Ukraine is legitimate under international law because they're protecting Russian citizens, right? Although it sounds a lot like what Hitler said about the Sudetenland in 1938 too. So I think there's really, again, I think of it as a criticism that has to do with further development of the idea, but it's also, again, like Professor Lewis is hard. It's really hard because it gets into the nitty-gritty details of how you actually design the follow-on system.
Thanks, John. So open it up to questions from our guests. Please identify yourself and then ask a question. Please, in the back.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. Mr. Yu, you have been very active in developing totally a new norm way of doing business, particularly when you wrote the Preventive Illegal Torture memo for Bush administration. Of course, it was approved by your seniors. I'm not just blaming you. And I just learned that you're a Canadian citizen, so maybe you got American citizenship by writing
No,
this.
no. I was born in Canada, but I'm a United States citizen. I'm a
Yeah,
United
I'm
States
sure you
citizen
wouldn't
now.
be in the Justice Department if you're not U.S. citizen, but I'm just kidding. So it's good to know that they put you there to write a memo
'cause I got
that
you
would
Canadian.
work. And so is this book also to create this kind of a thinking, which is, in my opinion, it's a totally barbaric international milieu we are talking about. And in fact, most of the people throughout the world will not stand for it. Maybe you can convince a few radical right-wingers in America, and they would probably follow it till it becomes Iraq and Afghanistan, where they finally have to be kicked out, being told that, thank you, we didn't need you. Anyway, thank you.
Actually, I don't think this theory is going to apply to radical right-wingers. So these days, my sense of American politics is that the right wing of the Republican Party actually wants to withdraw from the world fast. That if you look, say, at Rand Paul as the representative of that wing of the party, the Republican Party, it strikes me very much like the 1930s in the United States and in other Western democracies. Yeah, but I think they're radical in that they really want to change American policy, and right, they think the United States ought to do nothing in response to Ukraine, and nothing in response to the rise of China, and that we have. I mean, they would say we have put a lot of money into maintaining peace, and what do we get out of it? We get out nothing. So, Professor Lewis says, nobody gives us any thanks for saving lives anywhere. All we get is criticism, like yours, when we actually do go to war. So I don't think it's a radical right-wing idea. It's you are quite right. It is. Some people will criticize the idea of replacing the UN Charter system as barbaric because it's going to invite just great power, competition again, and neo-colonialism again, where you're. But I actually think that's not quite right, because I think Gary's right. Like that era and those countries are no longer strong enough or interested enough. You're not going to see France and Great Britain and Germany really using force to try to reimpose this kind of system. And I do think the U.S. is different, and so maybe we disagree. I think the U.S. is an exceptional country in that even though it has gone to war in places, even though it does maintain a sort of system, It's not an empire like the British Empire or the French Empire or the Chinese Empire. It's not interested in taking over territory to add to the borders of the U.S. It does seek to get other countries part of a system of economics and trade and certain and to suppress conflict. So in that respect, it has aspects of an empire, but it's very different in the sense that it doesn't try to run those other countries.
So I think if you look at the New York Times, if you look at the Wall Street Journal today, actually, the front page, it demonstrates that about 43 or 45% of the population prefers isolationist policies. And the United States foreign policy has, since the Roosevelt, Teddy, not FDR, has always had strains of isolationism versus interventionism. That's been a classic dilemma, and a whole range of strains of foreign policy about values or not values, and you can trace it back to the founders and different evolutions. So one of the things that it's at debate here in the United States for the next period is we've been extremely expansionary or involved in interventions in the last 12 years. And we are clearly, there's a sentiment in the Republic, as John is saying, want to pull back. And us pulling back, one will have to ask, what is the net benefit or cost to nations? And one of the examples of pulling back is what's happening right now in Crimea and the Ukraine, which we talked about. So it's really not, you're not happy if you're in those countries now, because it means that you do not have the force to respond. So the issue is, what will be United States' response at the strategic level? So when John talked about, well, he immediately went to the missiles and taking the treaty, I would take a step back. I think what that is saying is, you want to give the Russians and the Europeans a clear sense that the United States will be serious about stopping the expansion. Now, we have different ways of trying to do that. That's what that's about, telling the Russians, you will have to pay a cost if you continue to do this, and that we are serious that that's not the way you should involve in international relations. How you do that is the struggle. How you intervene to make it clear to them and to the Europeans that they have to stop. Do we really want to get into a fighting war? So one of the ironies of the United Nations and the MAD is that we haven't had a nuclear exchange. So if you ask Schelling what has been the biggest surprise, Tom Schelling will say that one of the greatest advantages of international public policy is that when he was one of the creators of mutually assured destruction, they thought by the turn of the century we'd have something like 25 nuclear powers. We don't. We're on our way. Well, that issue is we're now at an interesting tipping point, right? And that tipping point is creating a real new set of incentives and disincentives for how we understand intervention. And in the area of the world where you said you came from, the idea of more nuclear powers in that geographical area, given the propensity for these extraordinary border skirmishes you have, that really makes everyone nervous. So that's like the big issue about this book, is that where would be a principled notion of intervention, particular in the nuclear world, where we're very concerned about having a whole range of new countries go nuclear, and then we're all staring at each other saying, what will happen if a mistake is made? That's quite an extraordinary tipping point that we're at, that this book starts the conversation about how would you think about doing that.
One other thing, with regard to the claim that sort of undermining the UN Charter or removing the UN Charter is sort of barbaric and would not be something that most of the world would accept, while this is not entirely in line, but a good portion of what John's talking about is the justifiable use of force to prevent humanitarian catastrophes, which has a lot in common with responsibility to protect. Now, I know that his theory is not exactly the same, and he would not want to say, wouldn't want to be compared entirely to that, but responsibility to protect was something that has been debated in the United Nations, has been accepted at least in some ways as a modification of the limitations on the use of force. Unfortunately, in the final outcome document, they again tied it to Security Council approval. But the initial idea behind R2P was to say, if the Security Council doesn't act, here are ways that force can be used by regional organizations for the improvement of human welfare in much the same way as many of the examples that John's talking about. And that's something that the world has approved and has not viewed as being barbaric. So you can amend or soften the edges of the UN Charter without being internationally rejected.
And I might add that R2P is a Canadian doctrine, which is the part of the
why it doesn't
interesting
work.
revolution of John Yoo. And it's also the doctrine that our current ambassador to the United Nations was very strongly pursuing before taking power, because you want something, because you want a principled way to save lives and stop things from happening and use American power or Western power to do it.
Just one other comment. There's way too much Canada. This is the American enterprise these days. So, but and just a sort of historical note. Interventionism is really quite bipartisan in this country. I mean, it wasn't a Republican right-wing crank that went into the Balkans. It wasn't a right-wing crank that went into North Africa. So if we're we have a bipartisan tradition of being barbaric.
Really?
You can't have it, Jeremy. So you'll walk off with it.
I'm Jeremy Rapkin. So I want to ask about John Yoo's theory of global welfare in respect to Crimea, but just viewed from the other side. It seems to me it seems to me entirely plausible, if you just look at this from a very abstract global welfare point of view, to say the citizens of Crimea are better off because they've now been brought into a richer country and a stronger country and a country with a much more effective central government, and anyway, the majority of them are Russians and seem to be happy. So why can't Putin say on the U theory, yeah, it breaches the UN Charter, but it was an efficient breach?
Easy answer.
Oh, you give the easy answer. I was going to take you on this. It's not clear to me that the people in that region wanted it. So one thing you would want to maximize is the preferences of the people who live there. And it's hard to tell because, there was an election, but it was a classic Soviet election where 99% voted for the annexation. But their only choice was, I think, do you want to annex right now or annex a little slower?
So I just want to press you because it's very plausible that the majority of people in Crimea favored this. It's pretty clear that the majority of people in Ukraine didn't favor this, but it's not clear which is the constituency that matters. And you might say this is just an inherent problem with global welfare. You can't actually do a global poll all the time, so you always have to wonder, are we considering the people in Rwanda or how the neighbors feel? Probably the neighbors wouldn't have liked the intervention anyway.
I totally take your point, Jeremy. Actually, the last chapter tries to grapple with this. It's about failed states, and it starts well after page 5, actually. So, so in that chapter, I tried to figure out what this means because the two big phenomena of the post-1945 world that I thought were fascinating was the huge drop in deaths from interstate war, but there's a correspondence professor who says an enormous leap in civil wars, almost to the point where they are replacing, they've almost perfectly replaced the number of deaths from interstate wars. We're now losing with intrastate wars. And so I think that's a problem, exactly that you have people perhaps who are living together in states which are not viable states, and they actually hate each other enough to go to war. And so the other statistic that's very interesting is that during the past 70 years, the United States actually has promoted this in many cases, has been the disintegration of states into smaller states. So I think the number of states since the end of World War II has almost tripled. Right now, I actually, many people in the United States at different times have thought that's a terrible thing. You might remember in 1991, the Bush administration actually opposed the devolution of the Soviet Union and of former Yugoslavia, right? And I would say in Iraq, actually, in Afghanistan, we've been pressing to keep countries together rather than letting them come apart. And so I actually make the case that this is actually consistent with your criticism, is that Actually, global welfare is maximized when you let people of a common ethnicity or religion actually live together. They're actually, if they actually are going to be better off, part of it is up to their own wishes. But that some of the harm, some of the deaths from civil wars is we're trying to maintain nations together that don't run and really be together. Global welfare will actually be enhanced by letting some countries come apart. So this is where I think I disagree some with what some other AEI scholars is. I thought the best solution for Iraq was actually to let it devolve into 3 independent countries based more around their religious affiliations. And I know other people at AEI thought, it's better to the surge and to keep the country together as a unit. So see if that's actually going to turn out to be the long-run case.
Let the record show that John Yoo and Vice President Biden are now in this violent agreement.
And the other theoretician, Biden's theoretician, which was the son of the economist, the Canadian economist, Galbraith. First of all, the other event that I would say, John, that's sort of striking about the data, the way you're looking at it is, many people would say that the striking event post-1945 is actually the decolonization of the world. So it's the decolonization that helps spur these states. And then Jeremy Rapkin's question is, so then you ask, it's the E.E. Schnatz-Snyder problem, the semi-sovereign people, which is, what is the size of the unit that you feel comfortable making the vote for what they want to do for a collectivity, right? And as if you say, well, maybe the people in Crimea feel this way, but the people in the Ukraine don't, because it's the size of the political unit which is the problem. And then the well-known fact is all modern states are as a result of the use of force. We had something called 1860 to 1865 happen here, if I remember correctly. The United States is the United States because of the use of force. If you look at England, if you're a Brit, the Brits take umbrage if you're a Scotsman and you refer to say, oh, you're English. They go, no, I'm Scotch. Or I'm, Irish. I didn't voluntarily join this group. Almost every entity that you see that's a power has resulted of a small, take Germany. Prussia is the one who generated Germany, modern Germany. So when you start unpacking this issue, so the logical way, of course, is ironically, as fate would have it, the theme of the panel, Canada. Because we have federalism, Canada had federalism, and if Quebec decided to vote itself out of its confederation, I don't think Ottawa would have used force. Trudeau used force because they used violence. But if they had been more Menshevik-like and just used the ballot box, I think Ottawa would have had to have said, this is the will of the individual of this group. Then the question is, which is the empire question is, with all these small entities, how do they sustain themselves? And the genius of the American logic is you sustain yourself by signing up to our market value, which is another book that's quoted by John, which is the Phil Bobbitt analysis, that in the end we're moving to the market state. We don't need a state. We just need a state that reinforces these economic issues. But the problem is the value problem. These different states and these different ethnic groups have come with different values. So I have no interest in moving to China, given the values. I may have no interest in moving to India, given what's happening in the religious area, or Pakistan, or Afghanistan, given who will take power, quote, legitimately and enforce their religious views on those people. I'm not interested in that as an American. I believe that, the wall of separation, church and state, that's almost unheard of in the rest of the world. Well, that's our values. And that's really what's going to be, I think, at stake at this issue when we start thinking through when you intervene and how you intervene and what purpose you intervene for what value projection you want to intervene with.
Thank you, Professor Yu. Ted Broman from the Heritage Foundation. Extraordinarily interesting discussion, and I look forward to reading the book. One of my favorite lines in essays in international relations is John Stuart Mill's essay on non-intervention, where in the midst of an extraordinarily erudite analysis, he says, how do you deal with the problem of the Raj, the British Empire in India? And he has there the line, which I'm ripping slightly out of context, the rule of international relations is reciprocity, but barbarians will not reciprocate. And from that, you can generate an analysis which I think is parallel to, maybe even very close to yours, which would pull in a lot of other very distinguished thinkers in national relations who are largely on the sort of generally liberal side, certainly not conservative side of the analysis. Individuals like Burke as a Whig would certainly fall into this category as well. But I was very struck by your comment just now that you're suspicious of the number of states out there because many of them are artificial in one sense or another. Very fair, I take the point entirely. But this leads me to think that, just see sort of the mirror image of your argument. When you get a civil war nowadays, what's the first response? The UN or a group of powers rush in with a peacekeeping proposal. They reinforce the existing state. That's what they're there for. And then the conflict continues because these sorts of peace proposals never end up really resolving the problem. They prolong the war. So I take your point entirely about international law preventing intervention, but international law also encourages a certain kind of intervention, the kind of intervention that doesn't actually bring the war to an end, that doesn't allow England to create the United Kingdom, doesn't allow Paris to create France, that doesn't allow Prussia to create Germany. So doesn't international law cut both ways? It's destructive anti-intervention and also destructive pro-intervention.
I think it's a really great point. I think some thoughts and response. So there are things in the world. Decolonization is one. The spread of free markets is actually another. If you have an international free market, that's another reason you don't have to stick together. You don't need a customs union anymore. But the other one is that I actually think this approach, this idea of looking at the United States as a provider of security and stability around the world is another key ingredient to why you're seeing countries split apart. Because Harvey's quite right. I mean, war has been a motivating factor for the creation of nations, and nations have actually used defense as a reason to get bigger. And so if the United States is there in Asia, for example, or Europe, guaranteeing the peace, then why does Italy need to stick together anymore? Why does Prussia need to have all the other German principalities and territories part of a common Germany anymore? And so it's actually, I think that, and that's very much the United States policy, right? Spreading free trade, guaranteeing international stability actually is a motivating force in causing these collapses of nations. But you're quite right. Then the weird response, that's why I'm very critical. I share your criticism of international law. The weird response is that international law is swimming against the tide, right? It's trying to reverse this natural decentralization of governments around the world. And sometimes we act that way as a government too, oddly, that we try to keep the countries together. But you're right, the UN system is committed to keeping the status quo intact. So when you have peacekeepers, so when you want to keep, right, the UN initially wanted to keep Yugoslavia together, and I think that's right. So at the end of this, the very end of the book, definitely the part Jeremy didn't read, I talk about how to use force in very discrete ways to allow this kind of decentralization of countries to happen more peacefully than it has before. And I sort of look at the Iraq surge. Gary mentioned this part of the book in his introduction, is why did the Iraq surge work? So there were more people there. They did produce this area of security. It didn't look like anywhere near the numbers that people thought we actually need to be on the ground to protect the population if you looked at early examples like Kosovo and so on. And so my argument was that the problem with trying to do this sort of occupation was that these warring groups and civil wars, no one forces them to reach any kind of agreement to settle the peace. It's impossible for them to trust each other. It's impossible for them to sign an agreement and live up to it. And that's what the United States and that's what the surge did, is that it became the enforcer of the agreement between the Shiites and the Sunnis in Iraq. It becomes an enforcer in other civil war environments because then they can make it a peace agreement and someone has to keep it. But then that doesn't mean you have to have huge forces involved either, right? That's why maybe keeping the 10,000 troops in Iraq after the withdrawal or keeping a force in Afghanistan rather than pulling out really could contribute to stability in those countries. And to me, that's the lesson to draw from the surge and that's a narrower use of American force, right? That's not going to be as violent and destructive as full occupation with one, like there was a proportion, I can't remember, it was, one U.S. soldier for every X number of his, I don't think, no, I just don't think that's the right way to think about it.
So the issue that you pose is, which I think is, as John has addressed, is that, so I used to ask, one of the students we used to ask at the war colleges, do you think America is a revolutionary power or a status quo power? And that's the irony. But the issue of when you look at what we've been doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, as one of my Marines said, we're doing expeditionary counterterrorism, which is a contradiction in terms. Because unless you have a center of gravity on the location that you can trust and has that legitimacy of the system, you are on a very difficult errand because you're building on sand. And that's the issue that this book raises. If you're going to be doing these interventions, understand the principle, but the post-bellum problem is who is your legitimate entity left on that geographical territory that will assert and have the legitimacy to have order inside that geographical area to control force. That is the problem in Afghanistan now. That is the problem in Iraq. It's a core, as I said, Weberian problem of no legitimate, and we are in a very difficult box because of that. And that's both the you problem and our problem generating with those principles, which was based on very sound principles, very noble things, but that's why this is almost more of an idealist than a realist.
Well, I've got a question. One comment just on, and I won't defend this urge because other people can do that. Just on this issue of how, on the sort of, there is this sentiment in the book, which is a little bit of, we can get by doing these things with less force than perhaps we've done in the past. And just sort of the classic line is, if we had only let the Iraqi army stay in place, then, we wouldn't have had to be so deeply involved. But the truth is, and this is true for other interventions, the Iraqi army didn't exist. There was no Iraqi army left. There was a bunch of Shiite, conscripts led by Sunni generals, and the idea that, you were going to be able to sort of depend upon that force, which had no legitimacy, to sort of maintain order was, it just didn't exist. So I'm not wanting to pick a fight about that particular thing, but just to indicate that, when you do, in fact, do these interventions, and you almost inevitably wind up taking the government down, you're inevitably left with, being the government. And I think you do a good job of the book, by the way, actually sort of point out just how much there's involved in that. One of the things I thought was striking in the book, since you do cover an immense amount of literature, and in always interesting ways. One of the things that didn't seem to actually be sort of taken up in a sort of in sort of a serious way was the democratic peace theory. I think a lot of the problems that you're pointing to, in practicalities, go away to the degree that democratic states don't go to war with each other, and they tend to wind up being more peaceful and more prosperous. But of course, the radical implication of that is we should be in the business of regime change when it comes to other great powers like Russia, Iran, China. So I'm just, I don't mean to put you on the spot for something you obviously didn't write, but it does seem to me that's one sort of lacuna in the sort of discussion.
That's a great point. I have thought a lot about the democratic peace theory the democratic peace theory, as he says, since the 18th century. I think the idea is that no democracy has gone to war with another democracy. Although a lot of it depends on how you define democracy, because there was the War of 1812, which was a war. I've always wondered, how does the War of 1812, when we should have invaded and taken over Canada, but we left the job undone?
Yeah. There we go, Canada again.
Yeah,
And as you know, the Articles of Confederation actually have a clause inviting Canada to join the Union, which they've never exercised.
Yeah.
They would have been smart to do so.
They'll see.
That's another.
All the smart ones just move here anyway now. We don't need the rest of
We
them.
like to say the Canadians are to the Americans what the Greeks were to the Romans. We're here to help explain how to run an empire. Right?
That's what the British say about themselves too, and the French, and but I think the radical implication of the democratic peace theory, if it were true, would be that we should try to convert as many countries in the world into democracies as possible, right? Because then they won't attack. There's interesting things about it. The reason I didn't really adopt is, one, no one's really sure why it works. So there's no real theory about why the democratic peace theory actually is true. It's a statistical, right, correlation, but there's no convincing theory that anyone agrees about on causation. So I didn't want to. I mean, I had a lot of difficulty on what to do with it because there's people have different theories, but there's no real theory there. The other thing that's interesting about the democratic peace theory is that democracies don't go to war with each other, but they love attacking non-democracies. So actually, if you're a democracy, your rate of war is higher than an autocracy overall, because you attack a lot of non-democracies and try to do what you're saying, which is convert them to democracies.
Yeah,
right?
but one of the central themes of your book is give war,
Give more chance, right?
That's
So that actually, so I think that actually does tie in. If you were to draw a project out that tried to link Jus in Bello and the war after, the War of the Peace, that might be actually the third part. Would be, if you really want to get in the nitty-gritty of what kind of regime are you going to try to help create after you've gone to war and then after you've fought the war. And this does seem to be what we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, is you try to go all the way in and restore it with a democracy. Then I think that does bear back on the first question, because if it's a question of cost versus benefits, you have to factor that into the overall cost of the war. And our experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you really do want to take that kind of reconstruction role on and turning them into democracy, that raises the cost of the war way up. And I would think actually in the end may produce a lot lower interventions, where you can still save a lot of lives with a minimal amount of intervention if you're going to be agnostic about the regime you're going to leave after, right? So maybe that goes to your point about the Iraq army. If we had invaded Iraq, removed Saddam Hussein, and then left, right, the cost of war would have been a lot lower for the United States. Maybe things could have been equally bad. Maybe they could have been worse. Maybe they might have been just the same as they're turning out to be now. I don't know.
So this is, John begins the book with the Platonic canard that only the dead have seen the end of war. So if you believe the opening, we can never eliminate it. So, but the issue that used to be with the corollary to the notion of only Democrats don't go to war with each other, remember, was the Tom Friedman, countries with McDonald's don't go to war with each other, right?
I actually admired your citation of authorities until now.
Okay, so that
now you
facts of fact.
you're
Facts of fact. You quoted Plato. So the issue is there is an underlying assumption that's deep in the DNA of the West, is that if you have economic development, rises of middle classes then support democratic institutions. It's a bad Barrington Moore argument, because Moore demonstrates that it's actually those relationships that form between the elite groups and the people that they're receiving consent from can create a very dynamic economic market with a great deal of growth, with a middle class that sells off democracy for economic stability, which one might argue is Russia and Putin's economic friends. And then the issue is, that is fine. We are willing to deal with you as long as you stay in your box. If you're willing to maintain the economic relationships with us and trade and partner, the long game is that eventually we think that you'll have internal development and pressure for more democratic reflective institutions. That's the assumption. Historically unclear to me if that working assumption is true. And then it becomes a different type of format. So I remember one professor used to say, convergence theory used to be Russia and the United States. His view of convergence theory was Russia and Brazil. That's a different way of understanding mass integration and trying to figure out what to do stability and order. That's sort of the enigma for the book, because the book wants to intervene on a certain base of Western principles and values, but you may have great stability with economic development and non-democratic regimes. China. So this is one of the more interesting modern day phenomena that when I was in graduate school We didn't think like that. We thought stages of growth was going to make forward this middle class. That has proven not to be correct. The same way we thought 30 years ago when I was in graduate school, that religion would fade out, that religious ways of thinking about the world was an old way of thinking about it. Absolutely incorrect. But it's happened over the last 30 years, 30, 40 years. Also fascinating how you explain that phenomenon.
I think we're about ready to wrap up, but I wanted to give everybody a final word if they want it. Michael?
Just one quick thing on China. As you mentioned, that the McDonald's theory that two nations have McDonald's don't go to war. I think the South China Sea conflicts are going to rapidly test that one, whether it's China, Vietnam, China, and the Philippines. Any of those may well find themselves breaking that paradigm. And the Chinese reaction to the conflict that they are having with the various other states bordering the South China Sea are interesting, because they are claiming it is the democracies that are dangerous. The democracies, like the Philippines, are dangerous because the people have this sway over their government, right? If the populace wants to go to war and you're democratically elected, then you have very little choice but to go to war. Whereas Chinese don't have that problem, right? It doesn't matter what our populace wants, we will do what is right, is the claim that they have made in the various standoffs they've had with some of the other countries around the South China Sea. Obviously the flip side of the democratic peace theory in some ways, but we're thinking about it.
Harvey, do you have a final word?
I just want to thank AEI, and what's great about John Yoo is he's sort of like the Ackerman of the conservative movement, or Louis Hartz, which is that he basically explains there'll be more books based on his footnotes, which is a classic Ackerman move. So I look forward to coming back again, debating books 6, 7, and 8 in this trilogy on Just ad Bellum and Just in Bellum.
Thanks. I was muttering, I've been insulted repeatedly. First I was called Samantha Power, and then Bruce Ackerman, the ultimate one, being a Canadian. I'm never going to live any of this down. It may cause me to stop writing books altogether.
You have taken those.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I just, one point, just based on the headlines, was today there was this poll out that Harvey and Gary referred to that said Americans are weary of war. They don't want to pay the cost for maintaining a system. They don't want to pay for the big military. They don't want to intervene. And this combines our common interest in the presidency and national security and international law, which is, this was exactly the same attitude the United States had in the 1930s. You could almost take the poll results are actually very similar to the interwar period in the United States attitude. And it may seem like we're going to save money now. It might have seemed like in the 1930s we were saving a lot of money on defense. It ended up costing the country and the world a lot more. And so I think this is actually a moment where Congress really by itself cannot do the job. You really need presidential leadership to explain and justify to the country what's at stake. And I have to say, this is not a partisan political thing. I think Franklin Roosevelt, that is his finest moment, is that he really did work on persuading the American people that they had to bear a burden to make sure the world came out a certain way. And I think that's the responsibility of the current president. I worry that there's a lot of war fatigue, but we are actually going to regret giving into it.
Yeah, just final footnote. Actually, not so much in this the poll today, but there was a similar one that came out in Pew a couple of months ago. I have a colleague here who's spending some time actually going through the Pew data, and there is that headline, which is, we'd rather leave the world alone. But if you ask a second and third order question, do you still want America to be the, primo country? Overwhelmingly, it's yes. Do you want American leadership? The answer is yes. So implicit in that is, get back to John's point, which is that there's still something to be worked with, that if a little bit of leadership, not only in the president, but I must say, as somebody who works rather closely with a lot of members of Congress, it's only in last couple months that you've gotten members of Congress who are interested in reviving some of the discussions about what needs to be done when it comes to America's defenses. So, so the trend line potentially is there if somebody picks up the mantle and runs with it. But listen, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. We want a miserable day in Washington. Not that there are many great days in Washington, but nevertheless, this is a particularly rainy one. I want to thank our panelists, Harvey, Michael, and of course, John. And I do highly recommend that you pick up John's book, Do not wait for the movie version because it'll screw it up. But again, I do want to thank you all and thank our panelists.